This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate. We are spending the hour looking at the U.S. policy around hostages, how to have them freed. Among those with us, Philip Balboni, head of Global Post, where James Foley worked. He would be beheaded last year by ISIS this year. We're also joined by, as well, Gary Nesner. He is the former chief of the FBI Crisis Negotiation Unit, also author of Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. As you listen to Philip Balboni describe the efforts with Jim Foley's family to try to have Jim released, can you talk about what the U.S. policy has been?
Well, it would be a little bit frustrating. I wasn't able to hear all of Mr. Balboni because of some technical issues here. But, you know, the U.S. policy has always been one of making no substantive concessions to terrorists, and that's a good policy. It can be supported on a lot of different ways. However, that has, in the last decade or so, morphed into meaning no negotiations, which it never was in the past. When I ran the FBI unit in the 90s and up until 2003 when I retired, we were able to be far more engaged and supportive of families even when they chose to pay a ransom. The prohibition, in my view, should really be directed against the government paying money. We should not attempt to prohibit families from doing so, because that's often the only means through which you can effect the safe and timely release of a victim.
Gary, what accounts for this change in policy? You say that before 9/11 things were different.
Yeah, and actually beyond that a ways, but I think beginning with the events of 9/11, I think clearly the whole landscape of counterterrorism changed. Far more agencies, extraordinarily greater amounts of budgetary dollars, many more players came into the equation. Prior to then, the FBI, with some interface with the State Department and a few other agencies, would pretty much manage these kidnappings. And now there's literally a host of thousands of people in the government involved. And sadly, politicians and government officials want to be seen as unyielding and uncompromising in the face of terrorism. So they've overly interpreted this no concessions policy to become a no negotiations policy. And in reality, there's a great deal of space between capitulating to demands and a refusal to negotiate. And that's the problem, I think, that we're seeing now, that concern of being perceived as acquiescent has prevented them from pursuing things that we used to be able to pursue in the past that often led to successful outcomes.
And Philip Balboni, before the break, before we lost you on the satellite, I think we have you back now. Yes. You were talking about your contacts with the captors.
Yes. So that series of emails that came between late November and late December laid out initially the simple fact that they had Jim, and then they gave us the opportunity to get proof of life. We were able to do that successfully, and that was, you know, a true milestone, that we knew that Jim was alive, and we knew who had him. But the negotiation around a definitive amount that they would accept for Jim was never consummated. It never moved off that 100 million euros. But you have to remember that the Islamic State came under attack from other jihadist groups right around that period of time and were driven out of Aleppo, where they had previously headquartered. And they were forced into eastern Syria, ended up in Raqqa, which is their current headquarters. They began re-communicating, but they concentrated on the European hostages. And they knew about the United States policy and the British policy, and we knew from feedback from intelligence we gathered that they intended to leave the Americans and the British to the end. But they never resumed the negotiations. And I agree with my colleague from the FBI that they're private negotiations, family decisions, and this has happened in the past. should be allowed to proceed, and the Bureau has helped families in the past do that. And unfortunately, that did not get to play out in Jim Foley's case.
I wanted to bring Sarah Short into this discussion. Sarah, you've written about this for the Daily Beast. You co-wrote A Sliver of Light, 3 Americans Imprisoned in Iran. You were imprisoned in Iran for 410 days. Can you first talk about your own experience and how ultimately you were freed, and respond to what the U.S. policy has been for hostages in other countries and held by other groups?
Yeah, of course. Great. It's great to be here, Amy. Well, a lot of the recent stories coming out about the mismanagement of these hostage cases ring very true to me and my own experience. In our own experience, we were often caught between the State Department and the White House. After I was freed, after 410 days, I was in the center of negotiations for my now husband, Shane Bauer, and my friend Josh Fatal. And there were dozens of high-level meetings in the State Department and White House. And what it felt like to us after a while was infighting, finger-pointing, and just complete mismanagement of our case.
And when you saw what happened with Peter Kasig, with Jim Foley, talk about your response and what you feel needs to happen now.
Well, obviously, this is a, it's a very emotional topic, and it's a huge moment because finally these stories are coming out of missed opportunities. When we were in the center of this, we had no one to turn to, no one to guide us, and we were absolutely, flabbergasted by how things just seemed to get lost in the shuffle and never move forward. And it was this eternity of waiting and misinformation. I mean, I came on your shows several times, and during the time that we were fighting for Shane and Josh's freedom, and I felt strangled. I felt like I couldn't talk about my frustrations with my own government because in pretty direct terms, the State Department told us if we criticized our government's inaction, the Iranian government could take that out on Shane and Josh. So there were threats, there was mismanagement. And what I'm seeing now is that consistently our government does negotiate. First of all, the way that this whole policy is addressed is dishonest from the get-go. There are negotiations that go on, but I think that it's very unequal and inconsistent who actually gets negotiated for, what they're willing to do for who. And
could you say that,
you're still there?
Yeah. Well, Sarah, in your case, could one say that your case was different because you were held by a foreign government as opposed to a militant group like ISIS?
Of course, there are differences, but we got the same problem, was that our government said we don't talk to terrorists, we can't talk directly. So a third party was used in our case. The Omani government eventually ended up paying a thinly veiled ransom, $500,000 for each of us. And I think that's an extremely important point because our government says that they had this no concession policy and that ransom is never paid. But there was tacit approval for the Omani government to pay our ransom. I know that for a fact because I worked very closely with them. What difference does it make if money is getting into the hands of rogue governments or terrorist groups through a third party or directly? The money is still getting into those hands.
Gary Nesner, when you look at Sarah Short's case and the case of the Omani government paying the $500,000 for each of the 3 of them, I think at the time it was like cold bail, why did the U.S. deal with this differently?
Well, I wasn't involved, and I don't know the particulars of that, but I think we have to be careful too that resolving these cases, in my view, is not best served simply by throwing a big pot of money at the kidnappers. That certainly will encourage more. However, outright refusal to negotiate does not protect Americans from being victimized and does little to help effect their safe and timely release. These are very complex and challenging cases, and we have to have a whole range of tools and options available to deal with them. And what sadly has happened, in my opinion, is there have been an overly restrictive interpretation of what is appropriate for the government to do in support of families and businesses. And that's the issue that I hope this review will take a hard look at.
Okay, what about the issue of lost opportunities? This New York Times piece on Sunday called "The Cost of the U.S. Ban on Paying for Hostages" has a tidbit about Theo Padnos, a U.S. captive in Syria. And he says that his iPhone was taken by his captors. Now, he assumed it was that they removed the SIM card. It was never used. But he found out after he was released that his captors used his iPhone, but U.S. officials never looked for it using the, Find My iPhone option.
Well, again, I can't speak to that. I have no knowledge of what happened in the specifics of that case, but I would say this. I think when we say negotiation, that is a broad range of activities, and FBI personnel, negotiators, will, when deployed and assisting a family or trying to secure the safe release of a hostage victim, we'll look at a whole range of information available to us to gather information about the perpetrators and how we might open contact with them. So this certainly would have been something that I would have assumed was done. If it was not, I have no explanation for that.
And so, Sarah Shord, as you watched these as you watched journalist after aid worker beheaded by ISIS, what did you feel, having been freed yourself, of course facing death, but having been freed yourself as Shane and Josh were? Were the steps that needed to be taken?
Well, first of all, I think that we should review our policy on the level of mismanagement and incompetence, but also I think it's worth taking a second look at ransom and our no concession policy as well, which I also think is dishonest. I mean, it's clear that our government is willing to do prisoner swaps for servicemen and women. I mean, Bob Bergdahl, the recent trade with Cuba. And there's also cases such as the case of Raymond Davis in Pakistan, who was a Blackwater CIA operative that murdered 2 people. And he was facing charges in Pakistan, and then a blood money was paid to the family of the murdered, and he was released just a week after he was arrested. There were reports that that money was paid by the Pakistani government and that the U.S. government was going to pay it back. Of course, a lot of these reports can't be confirmed, but the point that I'm trying to make is when the U.S. wants to get its people out, they get their people out. But what we see consistently is that the work of journalists and humanitarian workers is not safeguarded by our government, that our government doesn't have their backs. And when the issue of ransom is raised, the argument is often we need to see the greater good, we need to prevent more cases like this from happening. I completely agree with that argument. We do need to look at the greater good, and we need to look at each case separately. And the Islamic State is not Al-Qaeda. We're not looking at the same kind of organization here. The Islamic State, for one, has its own revenue from their so-called government and business activities. They make $1 million a day. So a $6 million ransom, which is what they're asking, I believe, for the last American hostage, this young 26-year-old humanitarian worker. A $6 million ransom for the Islamic State is, it's not going to make or break the organization. It's a good day for them, but they have their own revenue. And you can argue that the propaganda that's come out of these horrific beheadings, the loss of life, has been able to gain them recruits that are perhaps more valuable and have done more damage and escalating violence than any ransom ever could have done.
And Philip Balboni, what do you want to see happen?
Well, I'd like to remind your viewers and listeners that there are 3 hostages still being held by the Islamic State as we're talking this morning. You've referenced the young American woman. Jim's traveling companion, the British journalist John Cantley, is still being held, and there is a 3rd woman whose identity and nationality is being protected. They are facing the same horrible fate as Jim and Stephen and Peter and the others. And I remain in touch with 2 of those 3 families. And the same, I would say, relatively feckless procedures are playing out, and there is not a definitive plan in place to secure their release. So
we're going to continue this discussion after break. Our guests are Philip Balboni, President and CEO of Global Post. James Foley worked for the Global Post when he was taken hostage in 2012. Gary Nesner, former chief of the FBI Crisis Negotiation Unit. Sarah Shourd, one of 3 Americans imprisoned in Iran. Ultimately, Oman helped to negotiate their release, paying $500,000 for each of them. When we come back, we'll be joined by New York attorney Stanley Cohen, who attempted to negotiate the release of an American, and Peter Kassig, before he was beheaded. It looked like things were moving along until the sheikh who was working as the intermediary was arrested by the U.S. ally, Jordan. And we'll hear that story in a moment. Stay with us.